Main trail right now first.
Hear yells calling for help. We're hiking down.
10-4, we're hearing them too towards the end of the lower part of the Devil's Den Trail. Trying to relay to the office that we found the victims down here. They're on the lower Devil's Den Trail. I've got two bodies down here.
On Saturday afternoon, July 26, 2025, visitors continued to enter and leave Devil's Den State Park in Washington County, Arkansas. Cars parked near trailheads. Small groups moved toward the wooded paths that cut through the hills. The park functioned as it always had, with no indication that the day would be remembered for anything other than summer foot traffic. Earlier that afternoon, a family of 4 began walking along one of the park's trails. Clinton Brink and Cristen Brink were hiking with their 2 daughters, aged 7 and 9. They had arrived at the park for a recreational outing, something they had done together as a family. The trail they entered was part of a large, rugged area known for dense forest, uneven terrain, and limited visibility between hikers. As they moved deeper into the trail system, the family adjusted their spacing naturally. At times they walked close together. At other moments, the adults and children separated by short distances as the path narrowed and curved. Other hikers were present in the park that afternoon, but groups were spaced far apart. Voices did not carry easily through the trees, and much of the trail was visually isolated. At approximately 2:40 in the afternoon, 2 children emerged from the trail without the adults who had entered with them. They were moving quickly and appeared distressed. Their parents were not visible behind them, and no other adults followed. The children continued forward until they encountered another hiker on the trail. The children spoke briefly. They stated that their parents had been attacked. They said a man had stabbed them. They said they had been told to run and keep going. They did not provide further explanation. They did not return toward the trail. They remained with the person they encountered. The hiker immediately escorted the children toward the park's visitor center. The route back followed the same trail the children had come from, but the focus remained on reaching a place with communication access. Devil's Den State Park is known for limited cellular service, and phone reception along the trails is unreliable. The visitor center was reached within minutes. Inside the building, staff and visitors assisted in placing an emergency call. At 2:40 in the afternoon, a call to 911 was made reporting that 2 adults had been stabbed on a trail inside the park, and that 2 children had arrived alone seeking help. Emergency responders were dispatched immediately. After ensuring the children were safe inside the visitor center, the hiker who had escorted them made the decision to return to the trail. He followed the same path back toward the location the children had indicated. He did not encounter anyone else along the way. The trail remained quiet. A short distance down the path, he located the bodies of 2 adults. Clinton Brink and Cristen Brink were lying on the ground. Both had sustained multiple stab wounds. There were visible signs of blood at the scene. The victims were unresponsive. The hiker did not approach further and returned to the visitor center to relay what he had seen. Law enforcement officers from Washington County and the Arkansas State Police arrived at Devil's Den State Park shortly after the emergency call. The trail was closed, and a perimeter was established around the area where the victims were found. The scene was secured to preserve evidence. Officers conducted an initial assessment at the location. Both victims were pronounced deceased at the scene. Investigators noted that there were no immediate signs of robbery. Personal belongings remained with the victims. There was no indication that property had been taken. The area surrounding the bodies showed signs of a violent struggle, but the disturbance appeared confined to that section of the trail. The 2 children were removed from the area and placed into protective care. They were not physically injured. Authorities confirmed that the children had witnessed the attack, but had not been harmed by the assailant. They were later placed with family members and provided support services. Investigators began collecting information based on the children's accounts and the physical evidence at the scene. The children described the suspect as an adult white male wearing dark clothing, a long-sleeve shirt, a dark baseball cap, sunglasses, gloves, and a backpack. They stated that the man approached the family on the trail and attacked their parents without warning. No surveillance cameras were present on the trail. The area lacked cellular coverage, limiting electronic data from the immediate location. Officers documented footprints, blood evidence, and the positions of the victims. Samples were collected for forensic analysis. At this early stage, authorities treated the incident as a random act of violence. There was no known connection between the victims and the suspect. The focus remained on identifying the individual who had fled the park following the attack. Search efforts were initiated within and beyond the park boundaries. Officers began canvassing nearby areas and requested assistance from the public. Descriptions of the suspect and a vehicle believed to have been used to leave the area were circulated. This moment marked the beginning of the investigation. 2 children exiting a wooded trail alone. A call placed from the visitor center. 2 adults found dead where they had fallen. Everything that followed began with those events, recorded in order and confirmed by responding authorities and official reports. Before the trail was closed and before their names appeared in official statements, Clinton Brink and Cristen Brink were simply a family settling into a new place. Less than 2 weeks earlier, they had moved to Prairie Grove, Arkansas, after living in South Dakota and Montana. The move was recent enough that parts of their new house were still unfamiliar. According to local officials, even basic utilities had only been connected shortly before the weekend they went to the park. Clinton Brink was 43 years old. He worked as a delivery driver in the dairy industry and was preparing to start a new position at Highland Dairy the following Monday. The job was scheduled. The routine ahead of him was defined. There was no indication that he planned to leave town or disrupt that schedule. Everything pointed forward. Cristen Brink was 41 years old. She was a licensed nurse, credentialed in both Montana and South Dakota. Her professional background followed her across state lines, suggesting continuity rather than interruption. There was nothing in her recent history to suggest instability or conflict. Like her husband, she was adjusting to a new environment and preparing for the next phase of everyday life. Their daughters were 7 and 9 years old. They were old enough to walk a trail without being carried, young enough to remain close to their parents. Family outings were part of their routine. Hiking was not presented as an unusual activity. It was a way to spend a Saturday afternoon together, especially in a state park known for its scenery and accessible trails. On the morning of July 26th, there was nothing in their plans that suggested urgency. They did not rush to the park. They did not tell anyone they would be gone for an extended period. There were no reported arguments, no signs of distress, no changes to their normal behavior. The decision to go to Devil's Den State Park fit within the rhythm of a weekend. The park itself was not unfamiliar territory for families. It attracted locals and visitors looking for short hikes and outdoor time. The Brink family entered the trail system as many others did that day. They parked, gathered their belongings, and began walking. The choice of trail did not stand out as extreme or isolated by design. It was a known route within the park. As they moved along the path, their formation shifted naturally. Clinton Brink walked ahead with the older daughter. Cristen Brink followed with the younger child. This arrangement placed the adults between the children and any approaching hikers, a common pattern on narrow trails. There was no report of tension or concern during this portion of the hike. They encountered other people on the trail earlier that afternoon. Nothing about those interactions was later described as unusual. No one reported an argument. No one reported being alarmed by the family's presence. They blended into the flow of visitors moving through the area. At this stage, there was no case. There was no victim narrative. There was only a family inside a public park, following a trail that curved in and out of view. The details that would later be examined had not yet separated themselves from the background. I stay close to this part of the timeline because it matters how ordinary it is. Not because it explains anything, but because it establishes what was not present. There was no warning built into their day, no decision that clearly changed the outcome. The events that followed did not begin with conflict or preparation. They began after a routine choice. The family did not know the man who would later be identified as the attacker. Investigators confirmed there was no prior connection, no shared location history, no communication. The encounter that occurred on the trail was not part of an ongoing dispute. It happened within the boundaries of that afternoon and nowhere else. When the attack occurred, it interrupted a sequence that had been stable until that moment. Cristen Brink was attacked first. According to court records released later, he attempted to fight back. That struggle would become significant evidence, but at the time, it was simply a response. Cristen Brink pushed the children to run, directing them away from the danger and toward help. Those actions were not planned in advance. They were immediate decisions made under pressure. They explain why the children left the trail alive and why the adults did not. The children followed instructions they were given in seconds, not minutes. This part of the story does not involve speculation or motive. It does not require interpretation. It is a sequence of ordinary circumstances leading into an extraordinary interruption, a new job scheduled, a family outing chosen, a trail entered. Everything that follows depends on this context, not because it predicts what happened, but because it shows how little separated before from after. When I recount this section, I do it carefully, not to add meaning, but to avoid adding anything that was not there. The family did not make a wrong turn. They did not ignore a warning. They did not walk into a known risk. They walked into a park on a Saturday afternoon. That is where their story was still intact. By the time the children emerged alone, that story had already ended. But understanding who Cristen and Cristen Brink were before that moment requires staying here, inside the part of the day where nothing had yet demanded attention. After the bodies were found and the trail was sealed off, investigators began reconstructing the sequence of events minute by minute. What mattered first was not why the attack happened, but how it unfolded on the trail. The earliest version of the case was built almost entirely from movement, where each person was, who saw whom, and in what order things occurred. Based on the children's statements and the condition of the scene, authorities determined that the family was walking along the trail when they encountered a lone man coming toward them. There was no indication of a conversation, no report of an argument. The encounter happened at close range, on a narrow section of the path where there was little room to step aside. According to the account given later in court documents, the man moved toward Cristen Brink first. The attack began suddenly. Cristen Brink was stabbed multiple times in the upper body. The location of the wounds suggested close contact rather than a strike from a distance. The ground showed signs of movement and struggle in a confined area, consistent with an immediate physical confrontation. During that struggle, Cristen Brink fought back. Investigators later confirmed that the attacker was injured during this exchange. Blood belonging to the suspect was found mixed with the victim's blood at the scene. This detail established that the attacker had not escaped untouched and that the fight had been direct and forceful. As the attack unfolded, Cristen Brink reacted by turning to the children. She did not remain frozen in place. She did not run in the opposite direction. She pushed both daughters away from the scene and told them to run toward the visitor center. The instruction was specific. It was not to hide. It was not to wait. It was to leave the trail and keep going. The children followed that instruction immediately. They ran down the trail without stopping. They did not look back. They did not pause to check on their parents. Their movement away from the scene created a separation that became critical moments later. After the children left, Cristen Brink turned back. Investigators later concluded that she returned toward her husband. What happened next occurred out of sight of any witnesses. Based on the injuries documented at the scene, Cristen Brink was stabbed and fatally wounded after the children had already fled. There were no signs that the attacker pursued the children. There were no reports of anyone following them on the trail. The violence remained concentrated where it had begun. Once the attack ended, the suspect left the area. The direction and method of his departure were not immediately known. There were no cameras on the trail, no cell phone data from the immediate area. What investigators did know was that the attacker did not remain at the scene and did not encounter the children again. By the time the children reached another hiker, the attacker was already gone. The children continued running until they encountered help. Their arrival without their parents marked the first public indication that something had gone seriously wrong. As law enforcement processed the scene, they documented the positions of the bodies, the blood patterns, and the surrounding terrain. The location suggested that the attack had occurred on a stretch of trail that did not allow for easy escape into open space. Dense forest bordered both sides. Visibility was limited beyond a short distance. No weapon was recovered at the scene. This absence was noted but did not disrupt the initial understanding of the attack. Investigators believed the weapon had been carried away when the suspect fled. Personal belongings were still with the victims. Nothing indicated that the attacker searched them or removed property. This reinforced the early conclusion that robbery was not the motive and that the encounter did not begin as an attempted theft. The timeline that emerged was tight. The family entered the trail. They encountered the suspect. The attack occurred within minutes. The children fled. The suspect left. The children reached the visitor center around 2:40 in the afternoon. Law enforcement arrived shortly after. This sequence was repeated consistently in briefings and early reports. It explained the scene without requiring additional assumptions. It accounted for the injuries, the escape of the children, and the lack of witnesses. It allowed investigators to focus on locating a man who had moved through the park and exited quickly. Search efforts followed this understanding. Attention was directed toward exits and nearby roads. Officers looked for vehicles that may have left the park around the time the children reached the visitor center. Witnesses were asked whether they had seen a man matching the description walking quickly or driving away. The public narrative mirrored this reconstruction. A family was hiking. They encountered a stranger. The father was attacked first. The mother sent the children away. The attacker fled. The children survived. The order of events became familiar within hours. This version remained intact through the first phase of the investigation. It was treated as accurate because it matched both the physical evidence and the witness accounts available at the time. There were no competing timelines, no alternative sequences. Once the initial sequence of events was accepted, investigators began working through what remained. The attack itself had been reconstructed as clearly as the available evidence allowed. What followed next was not a continuation of action, but a widening of space. Time passed between moments that could not be fully accounted for, and those spaces became part of the case. The first gap appeared immediately after the children ran. According to their statements, they did exactly what they were told. They ran down the trail toward the visitor center and did not stop until they encountered another person. During that same window of time, the attacker was no longer visible. No one reported seeing him leave the trail. No one reported hearing additional sounds. The trail absorbed whatever movement followed. Investigators could not place the suspect precisely in those minutes. They could not say whether he left immediately or paused. They could not say which direction he took at first or how far he traveled on foot before reaching a road. The terrain around that section of the trail offered multiple paths into dense forest, all without cameras or reliable phone coverage. There was no digital trail to follow. Cell phone data from the immediate area was limited. The victims' phones did not generate outgoing calls from the scene. The attacker did not place a call that could be traced to that location. No devices pinged nearby towers in a way that clarified movement. The absence of electronic signals did not contradict the timeline, but it did leave it open. When officers examined the ground, they documented footprints and disturbed soil, but the terrain made interpretation difficult. The trail surface was uneven, mixed with dirt, leaves, and rock. Footprints overlapped. Some impressions belonged to earlier hikers. Some belonged to responders. Sorting sequence from overlap was not immediate. Blood evidence confirmed that the attacker had been injured during the struggle. Drops and smears indicated movement after the initial attack, but blood alone could not answer direction. It did not draw a line out of the woods. It marked presence, not exit. The weapon used in the attack was not found. Investigators searched the immediate area and extended outward, but no knife was recovered along the trail. There was no indication that it had been dropped nearby. The absence of the weapon suggested that it had been carried away, but it offered no clue as to where. Another gap formed around witnesses. Other hikers had been in the park that afternoon, but none reported seeing the attack itself. No one reported hearing shouting or cries for help. The spacing between groups on the trail meant that people passed through sections minutes apart, sometimes longer. The attack fit into one of those intervals. The man who discovered the bodies did not encounter anyone else on his return walk. That absence mattered. It meant that the suspect had already moved beyond that point by the time the children reached help. The attacker had not crossed paths with someone heading toward the scene after the fact. Law enforcement expanded the search area beyond the trail system. Officers looked toward parking areas and access roads. They asked visitors whether they had noticed anyone leaving quickly or behaving unusually. The answers did not produce a clear lead at first. People remembered fragments. A vehicle. A man walking alone. None of it immediately connected. The vehicle became another space in the timeline. Based on later findings, investigators would determine that the suspect left the park by car. At this stage, however, the exact vehicle was unknown. There were multiple exits. Cars came and went throughout the afternoon. The park did not record license plates. Descriptions of a dark sedan emerged later, but in these early hours, the departure remained unobserved. The suspect had transitioned from trail to roadway without being seen. That transition point could not be fixed. The absence of a clear motive also contributed to the uncertainty. There was no theft. There was no known relationship. There was no prior threat. The attack did not extend beyond the adults. Those facts did not contradict each other, but they did not point toward an explanation either. Investigators documented what should have been present and was not. No camera footage from the trail. No emergency call from the scene. No witness who heard the attack as it happened. No weapon recovered. Each absence narrowed what could be said with certainty. The children's statements remained consistent, but their perspective ended when they ran. Everything that happened after they left the scene belonged to a stretch of time with no direct witnesses. The moment Cristen Brink turned back toward her husband was the last confirmed action before the attack concluded. What followed existed only in physical evidence. Search teams continued working the area, but the forest did not yield new answers. The trail reopened only after documentation was complete, but the case carried forward with its missing pieces intact. Here, I think about the parents left behind on that trail. The children ran because they were told to survive. Clinton and Cristen stayed because they had no choice. That knowledge is hard to sit with. Once the trail was secured and the initial scene was documented, the investigation shifted away from where the attack happened and toward where the attacker went next. From that moment on, the case was no longer contained within the trees. It expanded outward, following roads, vehicles, and time. Law enforcement made an early decision that shaped everything that followed. They treated the attacker as someone who had already left the park. There was no indication that he remained nearby. No one reported seeing him on the trail after the children ran. No additional disturbances were reported inside the park. The violence appeared complete, not ongoing. Because of that, the focus turned to exits. Devil's Den State Park has multiple access points where visitors enter and leave by vehicle. Cars move in and out throughout the day. There is no gate that records license plates. There is no centralized checkpoint. Once someone reaches a road, they blend into normal traffic almost immediately. Investigators began canvassing the park and surrounding areas. Rangers and officers spoke with visitors who had been present that afternoon. They asked who had been seen on the trails. They asked who had left around the time the children reached the visitor center. They asked whether anyone had noticed a person moving quickly or behaving out of place. Answers came back in fragments. At the same time, a broader response was activated. The Arkansas State Police joined local authorities. Specialized units were deployed. Search teams worked through wooded areas near the trail. Drones were used to scan terrain that was difficult to cover on foot. The goal was not only to find a person, but to rule out possibilities. Investigators knew early on that the attacker had been injured. Blood evidence from the scene confirmed it. That detail raised the possibility that someone might seek medical treatment or attempt to conceal an injury. Hospitals and clinics in the region were alerted. No immediate match surfaced. Descriptions of the suspect were circulated publicly. An adult white male, average build, dark clothing, long sleeves, a dark baseball cap, sunglasses, gloves, a backpack. The description came directly from the children's accounts and was released with urgency. Tips began to come in almost immediately. Some tips described men seen hiking alone. Others described vehicles parked where they had not been before. Many did not lead anywhere. Each one had to be evaluated, documented, and cleared. The volume of information grew faster than confirmed facts. Investigators also began reconstructing vehicle movement. Based on timing, they believed the suspect had left the park by car shortly after the attack. Witnesses were asked whether they had seen a dark sedan leaving the area. Cameras from nearby roads and businesses were reviewed, not from inside the park, but from the perimeter beyond it. This stage of the investigation involved choices. Resources were finite. Time mattered. The longer the delay, the farther a suspect could travel. Officers prioritized routes that led toward nearby towns, including Springdale and Fayetteville. Patrols increased. Traffic stops were conducted when appropriate. Throughout this process, one assumption remained steady. The attack was treated as random. There was no indication of planning tied to the victims themselves. There was no evidence of prior contact. Because of that, investigators did not initially look backward into the victims' lives for connections. They looked forward, following the suspect's likely escape. The park itself remained partially closed. Sections of trail near the scene were inaccessible to the public. Evidence collection continued. Forensic analysis began in parallel with the search. Blood samples were sent for DNA testing. Footwear impressions were documented. Clothing descriptions were refined. As hours turned into days, the search did not narrow immediately. There was no single tip that redirected everything. Instead, the case moved incrementally. Each piece of information either ruled something out or kept it open a little longer. Public briefings reflected that pace. Authorities confirmed that the victims were a married couple hiking with their children. They confirmed that the children were safe. They confirmed that there was no known relationship between the victims and the suspect. They did not release a name. They did not announce an arrest. Behind the scenes, investigators continued to work through logistics. They tracked reports of suspicious vehicles. They compared timelines. They waited for forensic results that could connect a person to the scene in a way that eyewitness accounts could not. This part of the case did not unfold dramatically. There was no immediate confrontation, no chase through the woods, no suspect cornered in real time. Instead, the investigation spread across geography, following ordinary infrastructure: roads, parking lots, service stations, places where people stop without being remembered. When I reach this part of the story, I think about how far the violence traveled beyond that trail. Clinton and Kristen were gone, but the world kept moving. Cars drove away. Roads stayed open. Somewhere, the person who did this was still breathing. That thought stays with me longer than anything else. As the search continued, the case remained open and active. Investigators pressed forward with the assumption that the suspect could be identified through persistence rather than chance. The trail had gone quiet. The work had moved elsewhere. The search did not end with a dramatic moment. There was no public chase, no confrontation on a road, no sudden announcement that interrupted the day. Instead, the movement that began outside Devil's Den gradually narrowed until it pointed to a single place, far from the trail where the violence had happened. In the days following the attack, investigators continued tracking information that had been collected during the search phase. Tips from the public were filtered and compared against timelines. Vehicle descriptions were reviewed again and again. What mattered now was not speed, but consistency. Officers were looking for a pattern that did not change when examined from different angles. One detail began to stand out. The suspect had not disappeared into the wilderness. He had re-entered ordinary life. That realization shifted attention toward towns and neighborhoods surrounding the park, places where people went about daily routines without drawing notice. The idea that the attacker had blended back into normal surroundings became central to the investigation. As investigators reviewed evidence, forensic results returned from the laboratory. Blood recovered at the scene was confirmed to include material that did not belong to either victim. That blood belonged to the attacker. This was no longer just a theory based on injury. It was a biological fact. With that confirmation, law enforcement began comparing the DNA profile against known databases. At the same time, they examined reports of individuals who matched the suspect description and had unexplained injuries following the date of the attack. This was not a single step forward. It was a narrowing process, reducing many possibilities down to one. Attention settled on a man living in Springdale, Arkansas. His movements placed him within driving distance of Devil's Den on the day of the attack. His vehicle matched the general description investigators had been circulating. He had a visible injury to his hand, consistent with the struggle described by evidence at the scene. Investigators obtained further information linking him to the case. Blood found inside his vehicle was tested and matched the DNA recovered from the trail. The connection between the crime scene and the suspect was no longer indirect. It was physical and specific. On July 30th, officers located him at a local beauty salon. He was seated in a chair, receiving a haircut. The setting was unremarkable. Nothing about the scene suggested urgency or threat. Officers approached and took him into custody without resistance. There was no attempt to flee. There was no disturbance. The suspect was identified as Andrew McGann, 28 years old. After being read his rights, he spoke with investigators. According to law enforcement, he admitted to killing Clinton and Cristen Brink. That statement did not end the case, but it confirmed what the evidence already showed. His vehicle was seized and transported for further examination. Additional blood evidence was documented. The injury to his hand was photographed and recorded. Each element aligned with the timeline investigators had established. When authorities announced the arrest, the case shifted again. For the public, the unknown attacker became a named individual. For the investigation, the focus moved from locating a suspect to preparing a prosecution. Formal charges followed quickly. McGann was charged with 2 counts of capital murder. Prosecutors stated that the evidence supported the highest level of criminal charges under Arkansas's law. He was held without bond and ordered not to contact the victim's family. In his first court appearance, McGann was assigned a public defender. At a later hearing, he entered a plea of not guilty. Despite his earlier admission, the legal process moved forward under that plea. Motions were filed. Dates were set. The case entered its next phase. As documents were released, additional details became part of the public record. Investigators stated that McGann had arrived at the park armed with a knife. The attack was described as deliberate rather than impulsive. The language used in court filings reflected intent and preparation. That shift did not change what happened on the trail. Clinton Brink was still attacked first. Cristen Brink still sent her children away and returned to help him. The children still ran and survived. What changed was how the event was framed within the justice system. Authorities confirmed there was no known connection between McGann and the Brink family. No prior contact. No shared history. The encounter on the trail remained isolated to that afternoon. The absence of a motive did not prevent charges from being filed. It did not slow the case. The weapon used in the attack was never recovered. Investigators stated that it had likely been taken from the scene when the suspect left the park. Its absence did not weaken the case, but it remained a missing piece in the physical record. As the case moved toward trial, the search phase officially ended. There were no more tips to chase, no more vehicles to track. The focus narrowed to evidence presentation and legal argument. This is where I feel the weight shift. The movement that once spread across roads and trails now compresses into a courtroom. The distance between Devil's Den and Springdale disappears on paper, but the distance between what happened and what can be undone remains absolute. Clinton and Cristen are no longer part of an active search. They are names in a case file, and that finality is the hardest part to carry forward. Here, I think about Clinton and Cristen as parents, not as victims. They walked into that park with their children and never walked out. Everything after that moves forward, but they do not. That truth sits heavy, because nothing in the process gives them back the life they were protecting. By the time the case reached its final stage, there was no longer any uncertainty about what had happened on the trail. The investigation had moved through search, identification, and arrest. Evidence had been tested. Timelines had been fixed. What remained was not discovery, but judgment. Andrew McGann was formally charged with 2 counts of capital murder under Arkansas's law. Prosecutors stated that the killings met the legal threshold for the most serious charges available, carrying the possibility of life imprisonment without parole or the death penalty. From the state's position, the case was no longer about possibility. It was about accountability. McGann was held without bond. He was ordered to have no contact with the victim's family. In court, he entered a plea of not guilty, despite earlier statements made to investigators after his arrest. His defense focused on legal classification and procedure rather than disputing that Clinton and Cristen Brink were killed. The court calendar moved forward toward trial. Before a verdict is reached, the question that continues to surface is not legal, but human. What kind of person commits this act? And why this family? Investigators did not describe McGann as disoriented or detached from reality. There was no record of hallucinations or delusional beliefs driving his actions. Authorities did not cite a psychotic episode. Instead, the behavior described in official documents pointed to awareness and control. He arrived at the park carrying a knife. He moved along the trail. He attacked deliberately. He left. The violence did not appear chaotic. Cristen Brink was attacked first. When Cristen Brink pushed the children away and returned, she was attacked afterward. The sequence mattered. It showed that the act was not a single uncontrolled moment, but a decision carried through to its end. At the same time, there was no evidence of personal motive. McGann did not know the Brink family. He had no prior contact with them. He did not follow them to the park. The encounter occurred because paths crossed, not because a target had been selected in advance. The family was not chosen for who they were. That absence of motive is one of the most difficult parts of the case to accept. It removes any illusion that this happened because of a specific mistake or warning that could have been recognized. The danger did not originate with the victims. It arrived with the offender. Background information about McGann offered limited context. He had no prior convictions for violent crime. There was no documented history of severe mental illness presented by authorities. Allegations from previous employment involving inappropriate behavior toward students suggested boundary violations, but they did not explain homicide. They pointed to disregard, not rage. What stood out instead was preparation without explanation. He entered a public space armed. He chose a setting with limited oversight. He acted and then returned to ordinary surroundings. There was no evidence of remorse that altered his behavior afterward. There was no attempt to seek help. There was no visible collapse. The court does not require a motive to convict. Intent and action are sufficient. Whether McGann is ultimately sentenced to life imprisonment or death will be determined by law, not by explanation. The legal system does not exist to make acts understandable. It exists to assign responsibility. For the Brink children, the outcome of the trial will not change what they lost. They survived because their parents acted in seconds, under threat, without knowing the outcome. Cristen fought. Cristen sent them away and went back. Those actions were not symbolic. They were physical choices that saved lives. The park reopened. Trails returned to public use. New visitors walked the same paths without knowing exactly where the attack occurred. There is no permanent marker. The ground does not announce what happened there. The case lives on in records, not in the landscape. This is where I stop following the process and think about the people. Cristen and Cristen did not die as victims looking for meaning. They died as parents doing what parents do when there is no time to think. Whatever sentence is handed down, that truth does not change. The lesson of this case is not that danger can always be predicted or avoided. It is that violence does not always come with a reason we can recognize. Sometimes there is no warning sign that fits neatly into a story. Sometimes the only certainty is how people respond when it arrives. The law will decide punishment. The court will close the case. But there is a question that does not belong to the system alone. When a case has a suspect, evidence, and a verdict, yet still offers no answer to why it happened at all, do you feel that justice is complete, or does something essential remain unresolved? Thank you for staying with this story until the end. These cases are not easy to listen to, and your time and attention matter. Remember that behind every detail are real people, real loss, and lives permanently changed. I appreciate you being here, thinking carefully, and taking this story seriously.